Good morning and welcome to this Middle East Institute webinar on U.S. policy toward the Taliban's Afghanistan under a Trump administration. American foreign policy has, after 4 months, seen profound shifts in its goals, priorities, and approaches. Afghanistan, though it now stands far from the limelight of U.S. foreign policy making, has not escaped the impact of these changes. This panel will explore the several areas in which the U.S., despite not recognizing Afghanistan diplomatically, finds itself engaged with the Taliban regime. We'll also consider whether recent developments in Washington, Kabul, and neighboring countries may have laid the groundwork for some meaningful reset of America's relationship with Afghanistan and a greater regional involvement. In our format, I will pose a series of questions to the panelists and encourage discussion among them. You're invited to submit your questions for the panel using the Q&A option on your screen. We plan to get to the questions later in the program. By the way, we're on the record. Now, let me introduce briefly our distinguished panel of seasoned observers of Afghanistan and the region. Douglas London retired from the CIA in 2019 after 34 years as a senior operations officer, chief of station, and CIA's counterterrorism chief for South and Southwest Asia. He served primarily in the Middle East, South Asia, and former Soviet republics in Africa, with senior management positions for the Near East, counterterrorism, counterintelligence, Iran, and cyber operations. Lisa Curtis is a senior fellow and director of Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for New American Security. She is a foreign policy and national security expert with over 20 years of service in the U.S. government, including at the National Security Council, CIA, State Department, and Capitol Hill. Lisa served as Deputy Assistant to the President and NSC Senior Director for South and Central Asia from 2017 to 2021. Joshua T. White is Professor of Practice of International Affairs at Johns Hopkins SAIS. He's also non-resident fellow at the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. Josh previously served at the White House as Senior Advisor and Director for South Asian Affairs at the National Security Council, where he staffed President Obama and the National Security Advisor on the full range of South Asia policy issues pertaining to India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and the Indian subcontinent. And Javid Ahmed is an associate fellow here at the Middle East Institute. He is also senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center, focusing on security and counterterrorism, transregional militancy, and illicit networks. From 2020 to 2021, Javid served as Afghanistan's ambassador to the United Arab Emirates. So, let's begin with our questions. And again, I want to stress that in answering your questions, please let's keep it the responses reasonably brief. Although I think we will probably have enough time this afternoon when we get to this afternoon I wanted to make sure we do get to all the questions, and also, and this is important, allow for some interpersonal discussion. I think that dialogue, that informality will serve us very well. Because the India-Pakistan crisis has held so much of our attention over the last 2 weeks, let's begin with a couple of questions about a possible wider fallout from those events. Could the U.S. role in helping to avoid an all-out conflict between India and Pakistan presage a rethinking of Washington's strategic approach to the region? So who'd like to start us off? Lisa.
Well, thank you, Marv. It's great to be here. Thanks to the Middle East Institute for inviting me. And I'm glad you're raising the issue of India-Pakistan relations, even though we're talking about Afghanistan, because they are very much related. And I think we can see that the Trump administration played a very helpful role in getting a ceasefire. We were in a very dangerous state last week, where we had 3 consecutive days of missiles flying across the line of control and the international border, drone strikes happening on military installations on both sides, as well as religious sites. Really, the most serious escalation since the Kargil border war, which, Marv, of course, we were both in the U.S. government when that crisis was happening, and we saw how serious that was. This was even more serious because that was limited to a certain part of Kashmir, whereas this, you had strikes happening deep inside territory, even outside of Kashmir on both sides. So we have a ceasefire. The U.S. played a critical role in getting that ceasefire. But I just wrote yesterday in Foreign Affairs that even though the U.S. has an important role to play in diffusing crises between these two nuclear-armed states, it really has no role to play in trying to resolve their fundamental dispute over Kashmir. This is a decades-old, intractable dispute tied up in the identities of both countries. India rejects the idea of third-party mediation. It just is not going to happen. And I think that the more President Trump talks about wanting to try to mediate a solution between the two sides, the more he risks alienating India and sacrificing some trust with that important strategic relationship. But when it comes to the relationship with Afghanistan, I think that if this will bring Afghanistan into focus, and that's because the groups that are purportedly involved in attacks in India, and in this case, India blames the Lashkar-e-Taiba, and that's why it struck its headquarters in Murudke as retaliation. It also struck the headquarters of Jaish-e-Mohammed in Bahawalpur, Pakistan. And we know that in that attack, Abdul Rauf Azhar, who was one of the perpetrators behind the 1999 hijacking of the Indian Airlines, which, where did it land? It landed in Kabul. So they were negotiating with the terrorists who were, had landed the plane in Kabul. The Taliban was very much facilitating that. India was forced to release 3 terrorists, one Omar Sheikh, who went on to kidnapping Danny Pearl, the Wall Street Journal reporter who was brutally murdered by his captors. Also, India was forced to release Masood Azhar, now the leader of Jaish-e-Mohammed, the group we just discussed. So these groups are linked to the Taliban. There are historical relationships there between the terrorist groups that are operating inside Pakistan and that target most of their attention on Kashmir and the Taliban. And, these relationships go back. We know that the LET had training camps at one point in Afghanistan during the Taliban's first stint in the 1990s when it was in charge of the country. So I think that this will bring Afghanistan into closer focus for the United States, will take on a higher priority when we see that terrorism in the region can bring, two nuclear powers to the brink of war. It shows just how dangerous the terrorist threat, the broader terrorist threat in the South Asia region is.
Thank you. Josh.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Always great to be part of something the Middle East Institute is doing. I agree with Lisa's assessment, and I would say that if we bracket President Trump's particular comments on Kashmir, which I tend to think, and I suspect the Indians and Pakistanis tend to think are largely ephemeral, he'll move on to other things rather soon. I think it's helpful to look at the impulses that seem to have motivated U.S. engagement in this crisis. And you can see this in the statements of Vice President Vance and those of Secretary Rubio. And I think the impulses are really twofold. The first is to look for quick interventions that can be framed as political wins, reflecting the leadership of the United States and President Trump. And the second, which is a deeper underlying thread in US politics that is emerging beyond just the Trump wing of the Republican Party, is to avoid entanglements. A very deep sense that the United States does not want to get embroiled or entangled in a longstanding conflict. We've seen this in the discourse on Ukraine. We've seen it just in the last few days as the United States, the Trump administration is rethinking its approach to the Houthi problem and realizing that this could be just a huge sink for munitions and funding and the risk of an F-35 getting shot down. I mean, there's a real anxiety about entanglements. And I think we saw it in this India-Pakistan crisis as well. And if we then think about what this would mean for Afghanistan, notwithstanding what Lisa said about the attention that this brings to the terrorism problem and its wider implications in the region, I think that's absolutely true. But I think at the very same time, we're likely to see an administration that does not want to enter into any kind of new entanglements. And they probably see Afghanistan as an entanglement, a re-entanglement waiting to happen. And that I think in many ways their response to this crisis points to the desire for these very focused, time-bound interventions. And we can talk together whether those kinds of interventions could or will make a difference in the context of Afghanistan. But that's how I see the style and implications of their response here.
Doug.
So first of all, likewise, very happy to be here. Of course, as a former spy, I get a little itchy when I hear on the record, but I'm getting past that. I'm all better. I'm pretty much in line with Lisa and Josh. The one thing I would say is the United States has a long history of doing this very thing between Pakistan and India. They've been accepted by both parties. I actually was serving in the region. I can't say which country, but it was one of them back in the late 80s when they almost came to a very significant war, where I remember officials shuttling back and forth and such like that. I think this was a really good opportunity for everybody involved. I like the way Lisa talked about identity in terms of India and Pakistan. They both need the Kashmiri crisis to go on. They just need it to go on as sort of a simmer, maybe a little bit sizzle, because it serves their domestic political interests. And both very similar in the sense of maintaining domestic support. Kashmir, Muslim threat, all that, that's a big issue for Modi in India. And Pakistan, the military gets its legitimacy by having that sort of fifth column and fighting for the struggle in Kashmir. So I don't really know that either party wants it settled, because it's not going to be settled without some sort of compromise. I think for the United States also, it was an easy win, and maybe easy is too strong a word, for the Trump administration, because everybody was on the same page. I think Pakistan and India were pleased to avoid being forced into this escalation ladder. And I think the Russians and the Chinese were similarly pleased to avoid a major conflict. So here was a real opportunity for the Trump administration to get a win and also be on the same page as Russia and China for a change. The Trump administration, from what we see, is very eager for economic deals and wins and such like that. There clearly is more opportunity there in India, it would seem, from our posture right now, than in Pakistan. But it's not to say that Pakistan doesn't have something to offer that the administration might want also. As to the ties and terrorism, I think we're going to probably get more into that. I'm certainly aligned with what Lisa says. We consider all these organizations, Javid Ahmed, Lashkar Taiba, these are all Al-Qaeda family organizations in a sense to which the Taliban is obligated. Of course, and we'll pull the thread, they're sort of more tied to what TTP, Taliban, Pakistan is doing in terms of its dynamics with Pakistan. But I'm sure we'll get to more of that later.
And Javid.
Well, great to be here, Marvin, and thank you. Look, I mean, I'm in violent agreement with everything that's been said, but it's good to see that the guns have gone quiet for now between India and Pakistan. But honestly, I mean, this whole episode felt like a bit of a waste and kind of climatic. Sure, there's a temporary ceasefire right now, as was said, but it's more like a pause until the next flare up. But what this crisis has really made clear, though, is that Pakistan still remains sort of a safari destination for terror groups who live and operate freely in the Pakistani heartlands. And that's actually the thing. Pakistan has almost always been a source of some new threat to the region with only kind of tweaks and changes in its own players. But what has remained constant throughout is the very danger that the country continued to pose to others, like India, but also to Afghanistan and the United States. Now, sure, Kashmir is a thorn in that bilateral relationship, but it's one of those issues that maybe just doesn't have a neat or satisfying solution for either side. But what's important from a U.S. Policy standpoint towards India and Pakistan, but also the region as a whole, is that U.S. policy does not revolve around Kashmir. Sure, the United States, just like this time, they have gotten involved, just like in the past, usually at Pakistan's request, and that seems to have been the case this time around too. India, as Lisa said, they've traditionally wanted the U.S. to stay out of it, though I'm not quite sure that was the case there this time. But for now, the important thing is that there's credit due to India for showing real political courage by striking deeper into Pakistan than it has in the past. I mean, think about it. It's not easy to target locations in Pakistani heartland, especially in places like Punjab and Rawalpindi. Even going after places like the Nur Khan Air Force Base in Rawalpindi, which is basically, the Pakistan equivalent of the, Langley Air Force Base, so to speak. It's a very bold move, and it shows and signals a significant shift in India's own approach. Or, for example, I think, like Lisa pointed to this one, India similarly going after targets in Muridke. It's home to Lashkar Taiba, or Bahawalpur, which, where Jaish Mohammed is headquartered. They just recently built their new headquarters just miles away from the Pakistani Army's maybe like 31st Corps headquarters in Bahawalpur. So it's really quite telling that literally days after this incident or crisis, the Pakistani Army chief appointed a new corps commander for Bahawalpur. And this is an area where you see a military and militant interests deeply intertwined. So much so that there's such a deep overlap in these areas between the recruitment pipelines for the Pakistani Army and groups like LAT and the JEM. So if you go to a place like Muridke or Bahawalpur, it's not uncommon for someone in the Army to have a brother or a cousin or a friend who's also simultaneously involved in one of these groups. And again, these aren't ordinary groups that operate on the fringes. They're woven into the very structure of the Pakistani military. I would say they're literally part of the Pakistani military's bloodstream. So the real takeaway, I would say, and last point from India's standpoint, was that maybe going forward, they're clearly prepared to incrementally increase and raise the cost every time they're targeted by these groups, and that's a significant shift. And this approach, I must say, Marvin, isn't just unique to India in that region. Iran did almost similar thing last year in January, I think, when it fired missiles and rockets at Pakistan in retaliation for being hit by Jaish al-Adl, another Sunni separatist group that's based in the Pakistani Balochistan area. So we're seeing this shift, as was spoken earlier, and regional norms and rules of engagement, where such kind of direct retaliation is now part of a new response playbook.
Well, do any of you want to respond to anything or any follow-up?
Yeah,
Please.
yeah, I would just disagree with Doug on one point, and that's that the Indians need the Kashmir issue to simmer. I think it's the opposite. Certainly Pakistan does. The Pakistan military needs the Kashmir issue to justify its existence. But when it comes to India, India is the status quo power. And, it's Pakistan that wants the change. And I think that India, even though in its statements it talks about claiming Pakistan occupied Kashmir, I think that's the last thing that Pakistan really wants, is to acquire that territory. I think, the Indians would be happy with a solution that basically made the line of control the border, sort of the status quo. So yeah, I would just, make that difference between, yes, for Pakistan, they, want to see the Kashmir issue highlighted internationally. They want to bring attention to it. India wants the complete opposite. I think they want to try to show that, things are normal there. It's, integral part of India. There's nothing that needs to change. And so that's, I think, the big difference between India and Pakistan.
Doug, you get a chance to respond.
Yeah, and just short, maybe I'm not gonna debate that. I just think our logic wouldn't necessarily apply here. I think Modi is trying to turn his whole brand is Hindu-centric. The Muslims are bad, the Sikhs are bad, they're all enemies. Kashmir is an issue. He's made changes in Kashmir that none of his predecessors made in terms of control over there. So I think, personally, he dangles it perhaps a little bit more than he ought to, based on the perfect logic you offer. But I think he likes to sort of hit that hornet's nest for his own political domestic needs. That's all.
Well, let me ask, Josh, you mentioned entanglement, and there seems to be a consensus here that we don't want this. I wonder, though, whether we have to factor into this the fact that President Trump was able to come away from it feeling he played a very special role, even personally, even though he wasn't directly involved, whether that personal dimension here, where his interest here in striking or creating new situations, striking deals, can sometimes override that.
I would just say many countries have spent a lot of time trying to crack the code of the Trump administration, both the first Trump administration and then this second administration. And I think those countries that have played it best have recognized the highly personalistic nature of how the administration operates, and that if Pakistan can get credit for bringing in an important terrorist, that the president cares a lot about hostages and being able to take credit for the release of hostages, that there are sort of certain time-bound kind of deliverables and engagements that will get the president's attention, and then perhaps can be linked to other more difficult structural policy engagements. And so I think that's been a lesson for many countries in the region, including in this context, in which the Indians were extremely nonplussed about the precise nature of Secretary Rubio's language and President Trump's language on Kashmir, but they have not pushed back in a very public way, because they recognize that this kind of attention by the president, by the United States, can perhaps be directed and channeled into other things that they care about.
Right. Let's move on so we can get to Afghanistan very quickly. Let me ask this question. Might the recent crisis influence Pakistan's difficult relationship with Afghanistan and India's efforts to rebuild its strong pre-Taliban ties with Afghanistan? What's your thinking on that? Javid?
So let me kind of, make a couple points. First, I'm in agreement with Josh and with Doug earlier. Lisa mentioned that this was a temporary win for Pakistan. In some ways, because the crisis kind of briefly pushed it back onto the international stage and maybe got some attention in Washington, but I think that attention will be short-lived. But when you look internally in Pakistan at their security leadership structure, during this crisis in particular, both on the military side, but also on the civilian side, there wasn't really, any good cop versus bad cop dynamic play. It felt more like just one cop with multiple personalities. Take, for example, the ISI chief, Asim Malik. He's a 3-star general, but he's also now serving in the middle of this crisis as the country's national security advisor, which is a role, which, has historically or traditionally been held for civilians. And that says everything about how kind of blurred the lines have become between the military and the civilian authority in current Pakistan, if not completely interchangeable altogether. And sure, there were some, who publicly called for that de-escalation, but those very same people were kind of quietly pushing for escalation. I would say what's more important, I think this concerns U.S. policy, is that because Pakistan used Chinese supplied platforms during this crisis, reportedly, the J-17s and the J-10s aircrafts, it will likely, I would say, pull China and Pakistan even closer, especially in terms of that, tech cooperation, military cooperation. And in that sense, I think the crisis in some ways actually help reinforce that axis. And I'm sure, given President Trump's rhetoric on China, rightly so, it would feed into that, and I'm sure he'll be reading into this one as well. From a strictly U.S. policy standpoint, I think Pakistan has some really serious internal problems that has nothing to do with Kashmir. They're in the middle of a deep economic crisis, a debt crisis. Their foreign reserves are declining. Their educated class is fleeing. If you take out the China component from the region, Pakistan in that very region is essentially friendless. And it's not also exactly a friend of the United States either. Just last year, the Biden administration, they slapped sanctions on Pakistan's main missile defense industry for, developing the long-range ballistic missiles and others that, potentially or had at least the potential of threatening the U.S. security. We saw President Trump throw a bone, I think it was January or February of this year, to Pakistan by renewing that maintenance contract for the Pakistani F-16 fleets. But I don't see, other than that, any real sign of, the administration pursuing a meaningful research in the bilateral relationship. As to your point about the Pakistan in Afghanistan, the broader impact on Afghanistan, I think, is quite minimal from this crisis. That's not to say there aren't risks. There are certainly, but they're hard to kind of assess, especially given how little reliable, credible information we have about what's really happening on the ground. But what I found very interesting, Marvin, during this crisis was this attempt that Pakistan made to draw in the Taliban into the conflict in its favor by claiming that one of the missiles that was launched by India had actually landed inside Afghanistan. And this was a claim that was immediately rejected by the Taliban. It was a very clever move, I must say, on Pakistan's part, as it tried to kind of burn the candle on both sides, but it didn't quite work. Taliban's own policy approach is still pretty vague. At times they seem non-aligned. Other times their approaches quite half aligned, and maybe, half aligned and half leave me alone sort of a situation where they selectively work with some powers in the region, including Pakistan, but also telling others to just leave them alone. And I think it's vaguely, multi-aligned posture with no clear direction, and it has worked for them so far in that case. If you look at it from a Pakistan standpoint, their view on the Taliban has also changed, or at least evolving in that case. I don't think it's the same old good Taliban versus bad Taliban framework. I think it's more like bad Taliban and worse Taliban. And so there's this growing recognition now among the Pakistani leaders that the Taliban, regardless of their factions, or they're turning more into a liability than an asset. And so when push comes to shove, I must say, Pakistan has shown, just like in the past, that it's capable of, ruthless pragmatism. in dealing with such problems. And if they decide that the Taliban aren't worth the trouble, I think they will look for alternatives and very fast.
Okay, Josh, and then Lisa.
So I'll just say briefly, if you think about Pakistani domestic politics and the impact of this India-Pakistan crisis on the Pakistani leadership, I mean, we're looking at an army chief who, of course, was very powerful prior to this crisis, but had seemed to have been in somewhat more tenuous a position than some of his predecessors. He had there was some appearance of factional opposition within the army itself. He was dealing with former Prime Minister Imran Khan, who's sitting in jail but has some significant admirers, perhaps still within the army. And then we've seen, he's had to deal with the resurgence of attacks within Pakistan that are linked to the TTP, many of which are coming from across the border in Afghanistan. Both sides, India and Pakistan, are rolling out their preferred spin on their battle damage assessments and saying that they did a great job. They're both very triumphalist. I think regardless of the facts of those assessments, this very well could shore up the army chief standing in Pakistan. Whether that translates to Pakistan's engagement with Afghanistan is a separate question. I do think it will translate to more spending within Pakistan on air defenses and conventional kinds of munitions. But the conflict with Afghanistan, the conflict with the Taliban government, is not one in which a consolidated Pakistani position makes a substantial difference in my mind. I would look toward how the Pakistani military learns from its use in this recent conflict with India about UAVs and loitering munitions, which were a major sort of domain of creativity in this conflict. Pakistan's UAVs did not seem to perform very well in contested Indian airspace, but many of these are Turkish and some of them are Pakistani indigenous drones, but they could find many interesting uses across the border in Loya Paktia and other places in Afghanistan, where Pakistan has clearly expressed interest in targeting TTP and other facilities. So I would not at all be surprised if some of those learnings, and in fact, some of those systems that did not perform very well in India, are redirected and used creatively across the border in Afghanistan in the coming year.
Lisa.
Great, thank you. Well, I just wanted to correct one thing Javid Ahmed said. He said that I said Pakistan had a temporary win. I said no such thing. What I said was Pakistan traditionally tries to get international attention to Kashmir, tries to provoke international mediation in its dispute over Kashmir with India. But I did not say that they had any kind of win in this particular crisis. And I think that, again, I'll make the distinction that, yes, India may have welcomed U.S. help in getting a ceasefire, in stopping the fighting. India will never welcome any outside role in trying to resolve the fundamental territorial dispute over Kashmir. There's a fine distinction there. And I think, if President Trump persists in continuing to talk about resolving Kashmir, it will have an impact on the U.S.-India strategic partnership. This is a very important issue for India to, keep any talk of international mediation on Kashmir out of the conversation. Second, I just wanted to make the point that, we're in an interesting moment. Pakistan's relationship with the Taliban isn't perfect. We know there are troubles there. Pakistan, has looked to Afghanistan for the quote unquote strategic depth when it comes to its disputes with India. And, in this case, I'm not sure that it had it. I think, from the Indian viewpoint, they would see that, that was something that Pakistan was lacking because of some of the tensions that it has with the Taliban. So I think this is an interesting point, and I think what this means for how this crisis will impact Pakistani policy is that I'm sure Pakistan will want to try to repair its relations with the Taliban, and try to get that relationship back to the way it was a few years ago.
Yes, Doug.
So I would only add, and I'll try to be brief. It's a win for Asim Munir, hands down, no doubt about it. Why? Because he got treated like a head of state. Who are we calling? We weren't calling the prime minister mostly. We were calling Asim Munir. And that helps to legitimize him, to Josh's point, which is really important. I have spent more hours with Pakistani officers in their military than I care to recall. And what always jumped out at me is, first of all, everything's Indo-centric. Everything they think, everything they do, and it is a big threat. That's the existential threat to them, because there's so many of them and so few of us. And it's about keeping their position and posture and reputation to use as a wedge against a populist revolt. He won on those accounts across the board here, in my humble opinion, just from my experience with them. He looks very stately. Josh is right. He's not always been as popular in the officer corps. He's got a reputation for being a bit more of a hothead, a bit more religious than some of his predecessors like Bajwa, who's a bit more of a pragmatist. So I think that helps. In terms of the dynamics with the Taliban, perfect example of frenemies. They really don't like each other. I've spent lots of hours, I won't get back, with Taliban and Haqqanis as well. And they each think themselves superior to the other, and they are using one another. And so I don't think we're going to see, a friendship, but a very transactional, what one does for the other, which will continue. Pakistan and the Taliban still have a need for each other. There's tensions, they will flare up, and there's always a chance they could get out of control. But for the Pakistanis, the TTP is more of an embarrassment. When the TTP makes an attack, it's not going to bring down the government unless it makes the military look weak. And that's what the military in Pakistan always worries about, is looking weak. That will encourage others to go ahead and challenge them and rise up and get past their reputation of being totally in charge and totally in control.
Any last thoughts here? If not, let's move on. How do you assess Trump's relationship with the Taliban regime? Has the Trump administration's approach thus far encouraged cooperation or greater confrontation? Is political normalization with the Taliban possible? Is that a realistic goal? Panelists, Doug.
Sorry, I have to figure out the buttons again. I'm going to take this in the perspective of what the Afghans see, if you don't mind. And that kind of breaks down a little bit in terms of which Afghans are we talking about. Are we talking about the Kandaharis and Akhundzada, the supreme leader, or are we talking about the Haqqanis? I think the Haqqanis, who are ruthless and brutal and they're really terrible in so many ways, are also very practical. They're business people at the end of the day, and they have a huge network to maintain and support. I think Sirajuddin Haqqani sees opportunity with the Trump administration. I think he sees this transactional, we're open for business thing. What can we, Afghanistan, do to win things from the Americans, like sanction relief or support or what have you? I don't think Akhundzada and his band of people think that way at all. I think they're content to be, as Javid often puts, a hermit kingdom, because anything they do with the United States, in their mind, makes them dependent on the United States or weak and vulnerable to the United States. The Haqqanis, I see, they look at this a different way. They've got minerals, they've got other resources. They could sort of let out debate of, well, we'll keep dealing with the Chinese, or we could deal with you. As the only thing I'll touch on the Trump administration perspective is, that's not a place that he's ever wanted to get involved with. When I served in that administration, the first time around, he referred to it as it's a cemetery in his minds. But in terms of what opportunities are there that he could see as wins or transactional, I don't think he, would have a problem with that. I think the Haqqanis were dancing when they saw the president of the United States seeing Ahmed Shara in Syria, a terrorist. As this administration, some of his members of his NSC has continued to label him up until the point that the president of the United States met with him and lifted sanctions. So to the Haqqanis' mind, with their business network across the Middle East and elsewhere, I think they're believing we've got a real opportunity, but the problem is going to be internally. How they sort that out, which is, a deeper thread that I'm sure my colleagues will start getting into, because I don't see a lot of cohesion there within Afghanistan.
Yes, Lisa.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to make a comment on Doug's mention of the Syria situation and Trump's meeting with President al-Shara, the lifting of the U.S. sanctions on Syria. Well, let's talk about the differences between Ahmed al-Shara and Hibatullah Akhundzada. Al-Shara, is helping Syria establish a constitution. He's going to hold elections. He's demonstrating a certain commitment to a democratic process. We see no such thing from the Taliban and Hibatullah Akhundzada. In Syria, women will continue to receive an education and work. We see no such thing in Afghanistan. We see policies toward human rights and women and civil society that are as bad as what we saw in the 1990s. So basically, we've seen no change in Taliban policies toward the Afghan people, civil society, and particularly women and girls. Whereas, we see a definite changed leader in al-Shara. So, I think we have to remember these differences. And Doug may be right. Some of the Taliban may be excited seeing this and think that that means they're going to get their assets unfrozen or they're going to be legitimized. But I would say that I see major differences in the Taliban regime and what we've seen in the beginning signs of the Ahmed al-Shara regime in Syria, and the commitments to sort of changing and being part of the 21st century, where we still see barbaric policies by the Taliban. We see public floggings of people, including women, not allowing women to go to school, the only country in the world that doesn't allow women to be educated. So I just see major, major differences between Syria and Afghanistan. If anything, my hope is, the Trump administration does hold the line on not conferring legitimacy on the Taliban until they make changes to their policies towards women. And if anything, this can be more of an encouragement. See, look what can happen. If you are willing to make changes to your policies and, come and be part of the 21st century, then we can talk about unfreezing assets and other things. So I see the Syria case more as an example that the Taliban should be made to live up to.
God, Javid.
Well, first of all, sorry, Lisa, for mishearing you earlier. I will edit myself by saying that whatever I said that. So, to your question, Marvin, I don't think there's a clear standing relationship as yet between Trump and the Taliban, even though there's engagement, as was said by Doug. Honestly, it's not even clear what the, U.S. mission or mission statement in Afghanistan is at this point. So far the debate in Washington had largely, been focused on scrutinizing the failures of the Afghanistan withdrawal rather than kind of focusing on what the future U.S. policy, Trump policy, or other policy should look like. I think, and this is something that needs to change. As far as Trump's own approach to Afghanistan, so far it's my understanding that the broader contours are still are being shaped of a policy or policy-like framework. But what seems to be kind of emerging, at least in my viewpoint, is a more tiered or layer approach from U.S. government towards Afghanistan. One that primarily focuses on counterterrorism and maybe hostage diplomacy, And that's largely because, the Taliban have essentially turned Afghanistan into this, like a ransom regime. But at the same time, you will also see, the Trump administration redirecting a lot of the resources domestically toward, maybe border security, information sharing, threat and terror financing, and maybe updating the, watch list and others. And like, here's the thing, a lot of that work still requires some form of engagement with the Taliban because of the risk posed by lone actors and lone individuals within the Afghan diaspora community here in the United States. Now, managing those threats may eventually kind of push the U.S. towards a bit more kind of regularized, if not normalized, relationship with the Taliban. That remains to be seen. But even if it's reluctant and purely pragmatic in a sense of engagement, but I also get the sense that, President Trump sees the Taliban not just as a militant or political group, but also kind of a resistant organization, from a military, political, but even kind of economic dimension, including how they operate. If you ask the Taliban, they would themselves kind of characterize themselves right now that they are pursuing kind of an economic neutrality in terms of their foreign relations. They don't appear to want, major power rivalries, be it between the U.S. and China or others, or any kind of economic competition playing out on the Afghan soil. Their focus seems to be stability, at least in the areas that matters to them. But Trump has been vocal about recovering U.S. equipment and platforms that's left Afghanistan. Not sure the exact value of that equipment is still unclear, but it's not about weapons, I would say. There's a lot of infrastructure and basing systems and airfields and other support setups that the United States built. And if you put that into monetary value, I'm sure that's, billions and billions of dollars. And much of that equipment, of course, requires maintenance. And I don't think it was also equipment that was built to be interoperable with other systems. So a lot of it, can't actually be used in its current state anyways. So if I was President Trump and I was giving him, the policy option, he will have three options, destroy it, buy it back, which usually means that you're going to be overpaying for, old and used equipment. And most likely you'll be going through middlemen, most likely in this case, Pakistan, or you engage directly with the Taliban, sort of, categorize the equipment into categories based on how much of a risk it poses to U.S. security, kind of more forward security, but also homeland security. But none of these are great options, I would say, and that's the reality. Another layer in Trump's approach seems to involve how he handles the anti-Taliban opposition. So far, I haven't seen any Trump officials openly back anti-Taliban groups, aside from maybe Mike Waltz. Even that was before he took on his previous national security role. But even if Trump lends some form of support to the anti-Taliban opposition, I think it's quite likely that going forward, it's going to be sort of a split in the middle type of an approach where they would support these opposition groups enough to keep them alive, but not enough to let it, win or kind of yank the rug from under the Taliban's feet. And this way, the U.S. will kind of overlook some of the Taliban's own destructive policies and behaviors, including on women's issues. And this will kind of play naturally into the best of, or even worst of both worlds on like on the Taliban and on Taliban side, where I think the U.S. could get some influence and, maybe influence that space without being fully committed to either side.
Hey, Josh.
President Trump, he fancies himself a problem solver. And he likes to take credit for solving problems, even if some people think he caused some of the problems he's taking credit for solving. Right? This is part of his approach to the world. And I think that all of us here, and probably most of our viewers in this webinar, would agree that there are huge problems in Afghanistan that need to be solved. Right? There's a terrible government. Girls can't go to school. the malnutrition projections by the World Food Program, even before the U.S. cut back its funding, were in the millions, right? So we see these problems, but from the point of view of this U.S. government, this U.S. administration, what are the American problems that need to be solved? And I think from that sort of political perspective, it's really unclear what the hook is, what the driver is for the kind of U.S. engagement on the political outreach, thinking about financial support. What is going to drive that in this environment, in an environment where the U.S. is cutting back on funding and frankly cutting back on many forms of engagement with areas that it thinks are peripheral? Now, you could say, look, the U.S. has cut back on humanitarian funding and food funding and so forth. Maybe there's a chance to then sort of negotiate this back to the Afghan government for something. And that's possible, right? That could be a play in this environment. It is rather hard to make the case that you are going to transactionally negotiate back funding for food or to support infant, reduction in infant mortality without looking sort of crass in a way. But that maybe is a trade space. And so I think it's important for all of us and everyone who works on Afghanistan to look realistically at what the manifold problems are within the country, but also think about the incentive structure, not just for the United States, but for this administration to re-engage in ways that meaningfully address those problems. And we've talked about a few of those, with equipment left behind, with hostages, with some counterterrorism issues that could prompt that kind of engagement. But absent a hook, I think, and I fear that that Afghanistan will be an issue that this administration continues to bracket in its attempt to avoid entanglements and avoid issues where there's not a ripe opportunity to take credit for progress.
Lisa, you wanted to get back into it.
Yeah, so I think Josh made a good point. What's going to be the hook? Well, we do know from Javid's comments that the Trump administration is interested in counterterrorism. Like that's definitely a high priority. But what does that mean? Does that mean just working with the Taliban on countering ISIS-K? Does that mean having some over-the-horizon capabilities that potentially may have to be used? Does that mean working with surrounding countries, Pakistan, Central Asian states? Or does that mean, potentially having a slightly broader strategy where you are trying to actually have a more inclusive governing system? You're trying to encourage some kind of process of negotiations, which would involve human rights issues. It depends on the Trump administration and what strategy they are going to employ. And I think, so far what we've seen over the last 3 months, we haven't seen a lot of sort of very clear-cut strategies where you can see, lines of effort, and goals and how to meet those goals. But there's still time, and it's early days. So will we see a more well thought out strategy coming from this administration on Afghanistan that might be a bit broader? I mean, so far we've only seen transactionalism, right? We've seen 4 Americans returned from Taliban custody, which is great. I am very happy to see those Americans safe back with their families. What was the cost? Well, we removed some of the bounties on the Haqqani network leaders. So, there's that transactionalism, but will there be an effort to have a broader strategy that tries to, follow some kind of roadmap like that that was laid out in 2023 by the UN Security Council. Here I'm talking about the independent assessment, which seems to just be collecting dust rather than being implemented, unfortunately, because I think it laid out a pretty good roadmap for how to talk with the Taliban, how to condition the process, the political process on the Taliban also taking certain steps. But, you know, we just haven't seen whether the Trump administration is just going to continue with its transactionalism in Afghanistan or whether it will actually come up with a broader strategy that can help prevent terrorism in the country over the long term.
Yes, Javid.
Very, very briefly, I mean, I think it would be important to kind of, classify this as what US priorities are and what Trump wants, what Taliban priorities are, what they want, and where is the convergence. Now, from a US standpoint, there's counterterrorism, there's hostages, there's counterintelligence information sharing, there's also a need for some kind of a liaison relationship through maybe some kind of a support facility on the ground in Afghanistan. From a Taliban standpoint, they want, a normalization of relationship with some kind of a path or an action plan towards ultimate diplomatic recognition. They want a removal of blacklists, removal of travel restrictions, the release of financial assets, but also, non-interventionist kind of approach to the Taliban's own local policies on social issues, including on human rights and women's rights. And interestingly, the most kind of contentious among these demands from the Taliban side are the ones that are on social issues. So the question now is whether Trump will treat, women's rights issues in Afghanistan as a national security priority. From my viewpoint, I highly doubt it. Right. But that said, even if there's a deeper U.S. engagement with the Taliban, I have no illusions, and I don't think President Trump has any illusions that it will magically change the Taliban character or who they are. But I don't think that's how it works. But the successful engagement in his, viewpoint, and at least, is kind of my conviction too, is that it's not just about President Trump's message; it's also about the messenger itself. A lot of Afghan policy will depend on who President Trump chooses to lead the Afghanistan file, whether that's at state or at the NSC or elsewhere. Last point on China, because President Trump has brought up, the China's increasing involvement in Afghanistan repeatedly in his public remarks, I think the Taliban stand to benefit from this as well, not as victims of this kind of near-peer competition, but as sort of opportunistic players who could, extract value from both sides. And through all of this, what's striking is that, the Taliban haven't taken a strongly anti-US position. In fact, they've made clear that they're seeking a more normalized and direct relationship with Washington, but on their own terms, and surely not mediated through countries like Pakistan. So to some extent, that desire is shaping how the Taliban manages their own relationship with China, where I think the US is still an important factor, even if it's not actively in the room between the two sides.
Okay. Yes, Doug.
So I think we've opened the door to terrorism. So I'm just going to go ahead and launch in if you don't mind.
I was just going to get to it.
Yeah, I think we're there. So I would submit to you all that the United States and including this administration and the Taliban do have some common CT interests, and it's not just the obvious, which is ISIS-K. It's also embarrassment. So neither the White House nor the Taliban regime want an Al-Qaeda attack whose fingerprints are all over Afghanistan. So Al-Qaeda does something that's attributed to its affiliates. Okay, that's one thing, but it's bad optics for both Washington and the Taliban. I won't say Kabul because I think that's Taliban has really ruled from Kandahar based on the Taliban's commitment to at least keep AQ in the box, to the extent that they're hosting AQ there. I don't know, Saifullah Adil, who's the current emir, most likely is still in Iran or Afghanistan. That's hard to say. He could be either, but there are certainly some senior Al-Qaeda folks who are there. Hamza al-Ghamdi, who's most likely Zawahiri's caretakers, most likely still in Afghanistan. He was probably there when Zawahiri got killed. But, Haqqani doesn't take ISIS-K lightly. They killed Khalil Haqqani. That was a huge, huge deal. We tried to kill Haqqani, that particularly Haqqani, for years. He was sort of like Sirajuddin's special envoy. He maintained liaison with ISI in Pakistan. He maintained liaison with AQ. He was sort of their go-to guy. And he was kind of operating in a sense as kind of like chief of intel operations in Kabul, at least more or less. And ISIS-K got to him. So that's kind of a big deal. The Russians are now very publicly saying they're working with the Taliban on ISIS-K to the extent that they're going to do capacity support and exchange, just what little detail they provided in the press. And that's pretty recent. That's another consideration. So I don't really believe, even technically, that this White House has to make concessions on human rights or women's issues to have some degree of cooperation on intel and CT. The United States government operates under numerous waivers with partners who have committed human rights abuses, extrajudicial killings where it is in US interests. So while I suspect it was probably an issue in the previous administration in perhaps trying to leverage cooperation to secure other American goals, I don't necessarily see the Trump administration having to prioritize leveraging whatever it would do in terms of cooperating with the Taliban, the Haqqanis, in terms of CT to influence their behavior. I certainly think Akhundzada thinks that's an issue. I don't think Sirajuddin Haqqani is all too worried about that, particularly now. And I don't think it would be an obstacle. Do we need the Taliban to do some of our work? I think it's probably mutually beneficial. I think Javid's point is one that he and I have written about. The idea of having some sort of liaison, having some sort of platform. It doesn't get you just CT. It gets you eyes and ears on the ground. It gets you some regular daily engagement with the Taliban, and it gives you currency with which to, maybe secure a bit more influence as well as insight into what is happening. I have not seen major moves, at least in public, in terms of this administration, what they're doing, but I'd have to imagine there's still some degree of exchange, some degree of cooperation. I don't know that we have capacity building because that becomes more problematic, and that's where the Hill gets involved a little bit. But I wouldn't rule it out based on how it might be framed as being in terms of U.S. interest.
Good. Yes, Lisa.
Can I just come in quickly, because I think that was an important point, that the U.S. working with the Taliban on its CT interests, I would say mainly against ISIS-K, does not mean that the U.S. has to sacrifice its interests in seeing, women's rights respected, continuing education programs. This is a big deal. I think, the Biden administration, for, all its mistakes that were made with withdrawal, did some helpful things in the last couple of years, which was held the line on not legitimizing the Taliban, insisting that, this issue was linked to the Taliban's treatment of women and girls. And then second, continuing programs for online education for girls and women, continuing to have American University of Afghanistan operating out of Qatar, educating Afghans, including women, scholarships, offering scholarships for women to be able to get out of Afghanistan, get an education. This is all very important, and it's not very expensive. So these are things that the Trump administration can and should continue. So it shouldn't be an either or strategy. Fine, we want to, share some intelligence, cooperate with the Taliban against our mutual terrorism threats. I have no problem with that. What I have a problem with is if we feel the need to then ease up on the Taliban when it comes to women and girls and human rights issues because of that cooperation. I think we need to be doing both at the same time. We don't need to legitimize the Taliban to be able to cooperate with them on counterterrorism. And so I think, that's the fine line that the Trump administration has to walk, cooperating where we must, but not sacrificing our policies on women and girls and human rights, and recognizing that the treatment of women and girls is also related to the terrorism issue. The more they are persecuted, repressed, the more you're going to see extremism, terrorism in these, 25,000 madrasas that we have seen sprout up. So you have your short-term counterterrorism interests, but you also have a long-term interest in not seeing Afghanistan turn into this, hub of terrorism or deepen as a hub of terrorism. And for that, you do have to focus on the social issues because that has a direct impact on the sort of environment for extremism and terrorism to grow in the country.
Can I just add really briefly? I mean, we don't have extensive causal research on some of these questions, but I do think it's pretty clear that if the U.S. posture is to dramatically cut humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan, food support, tuberculosis tracing, healthcare, education, all of the really hundreds of millions of dollars that were suspended. The very least, we should be able to say like that is not going to do good things for the overall social environment for extremism over the medium and long term. So I think and I know we all believe that, but I think that needs to be part of this discourse. Yes, the Trump team will be looking for places where there are transactional interests. Yes, they will be focusing on the counterterrorism questions as they should. Yes, hopefully they continue the necessary advocacy for women and girls, but the sort of the baseline humanitarian environment is extremely fragile, and I think that that it's not clear after this first wave of reviews by the Trump administration whether that is sufficiently recognized and dealt with, in that the funding is still largely withheld in ways that could have ripple effects we don't entirely understand.
Hey, Javid, were you raising your hand there?
Yeah, very, very quickly. I mean, what's clear that, Afghanistan is a continuing source of threat, because of a presence of a range of problematic groups. But that's different than, making blanket judgments about whether the Taliban are entirely part of the problem or entirely part of the solution. I think it'd be a little bit more nuanced than that, because if you take the presence of foreign fighters in that country, right, as an example, whether or not they're formally affiliated with any, established groups there, but many are somehow easily settling in locals, societies and communities without, much resistance from the Taliban or even ordinary Afghans. And so you would see these groups, they often kind of collaborate amongst themselves. They're trading weapons, they're releasing each other prisoners, they're pooling that, resources for operational purposes. At times, even kind of their mission spaces have kind of conjoined, and all under the Taliban's watch. Now, that kind of an informal ecosystem, assuming that, builds up, is quite dangerous, because you don't want these groups kind of carving out their own jihadi fiefdoms, like, what we had under the warlords in the previous government, and they kind of create their pockets of ungoverned spaces without, any recognized authority recognized as a central government. So, because the worst case scenario in this case that could potentially emerge is then a discredited Taliban regime that's propped up by major regional players. They're exploiting their resources, but they're also welcoming these foreign mercenaries, very similar to what we're seeing right now in places like Mali and Burkina Faso, Nigeria, and elsewhere. And that's not kind of the model that Afghanistan can afford under the Taliban, without the Taliban, to follow. What the alternative in this case is, and Doug spoke about this, is that, direct personal diplomacy, quiet engagement that prioritizes some kind of a discretion over, grandstanding. If that happens in some kind of a policy framework, great, but that's where the space for, U.S. influence still exists. And I think even in this kind of fractured landscape in the region. You spoke about, India, Kashmir, and elsewhere. And I don't say this because I enjoy saying it. I say it because it's the observable truth on the ground, because the last 3.5 or 4 years under the Taliban rule, they've actually proven to be a lot more predictable than the last 3 or 4 years of the previous government with which I was, especially when it comes to the Taliban's own staying power. And so that doesn't mean it's ideal, but it's kind of stable in its own way.
Talking about stability, does the U.S. have an interest in the stability of this government in Kabul? Because we've already mentioned the fact that it's not actively backing resistance, are there actions that the United States could or could not be taking which would affect the ability of this government to avoid destabilization and what might be the consequences of that?
Sorry, Marvin, were you asking me?
Yeah, well, I'm asking
Oh, cool.
whoever
Okay.
would like to jump into it.
I think stability is in everybody's interest, but stability in Afghanistan, it's kind of like an oxymoron in terms of just the history of that place. It's just so factional and so divided, and in a very sinister way. You could have folks who might argue some instability could be in our interest if it brings down the Taliban. I think U.S. policy, at least in terms of what the Afghans are seeing, and again, I keep trying to put myself in terms of what I think they're seeing and then how they're going to react, is that the United States is not terribly interested one way or another. They've done their nation building thing. They don't want to do that anymore. At the same time, they don't want to add to or lend to the possibility of greater civil war, because that's refugees and instability, ungoverned states, and that's bad for everybody throughout the region. So in terms of what the United States could do deliberately, I think most importantly is to have a better understanding of what's going on inside. It is really hard to look and understand, and Javid's right, as far as observables, the Taliban has been fairly consistent and predictable, not always in a good way. There's certainly been evidence of infighting, tensions, particularly between Haqqani, Mohammed Yaqub, sort of being in one place, and Akhundzada and his people in another place, in terms of, and I know Javid's written about this, Akhundzada has the ultimate, get out of jail free card. Whatever happens is God's will, right? That's just the way it is. And I'm your connection to that. So whereas I think the Haqqanis and Yaqub are a little bit more practical, want to see an actual country, want to see what they could sort of put together. Not that I'm fans of theirs. I'm just saying that they're probably a little bit easier to deal with because there's tangible things that you could trade off with in a transactional, where I think that's probably less so with the current supreme leader. So that puts the United States in a real hard place, because who am I dealing with? At the end of the day, it's still run by the supreme leader. We still see Haqqanis and Yaqub get in line. They want to be very careful about how much dissidence, how much daylight appears between all of them, because again, nobody wants civil war. So I keep, sort of being that horse that the United States could have greater influence if it has greater understanding and has some greater connectivity. And to Lisa's point and everybody's point is, that does not mean, bestowing credibility on that regime and speaking nice of them. But the reason we've been their number one provider of aid is because we don't want to see chaos. We don't want to see collapse. That's not good for us. That's not good for the region. So I think it's a very delicate path the United States needs to continue walking in terms of what it can do to forestall, avoid that sort of chaos, and at the same time not expect doing so is going to give it greater influence, particularly with this government at this time, but it keeps them in the game. And we need to be in the game to have some insight, and it's that insight that's going to inform our decision-making on our risk calculus and what leverage we might be able to employ to secure our goals.
Yes, Liz.
Yeah, I just want to come back on this idea of stability. So, of course, there's less fighting. It was the Taliban that was fighting the Ghani government. So it's not surprising that we have less fighting now that the Taliban has taken over. And again, there's been no election. There's not support from the Afghan people for the Taliban. They've taken over by military force. So I don't think that we should make too much of the fact that there is less fighting now than there was 5 years ago. You still have massive problems with the economy. You have humanitarian problems that we've been talking about. So it's kind of like, what is the definition of stability? And I think what's more important to look at is this regime providing safe haven to global terrorists? And how is it treating its own people? And those are the things that we should be looking at, because stability is worth very little if people are starving and people have no rights.
Yes, Javid.
Very briefly, I don't think the U.S. should approach its future Afghan policy through the lens of some kind of shared values. I don't think those kind of narratives hold up anymore, simply because they do not apply in the current context. When there was a collapse of the Afghan government, it wasn't just a political collapse; it was also a societal collapse. And so there's very little left of that kind of value narrative to lean on, at least from my standpoint. Main priority for the U.S. is, as it was said, counterterrorism, mainly involving, ISIS-K, maybe Al-Qaeda's regional affiliates like AQIS and others, but also a kind of this growing number of unaffiliated fighters who, effectively serve as, these groups, contractors or subcontractors for a variety of reasons. And they present that, counterterrorism challenge, but not just counterterrorism challenge, from also a serious counterintelligence problem as well. So there's actually this shared interest here between the U.S. and Afghanistan, and that is basically the interest to cooperate. So the bigger the ISIS-K threat becomes, I think the more likely it is, for the U.S. to find itself having to work with the current government in Kabul and Kandahar, however reluctantly that engagement might be. And I think that could potentially also then lead off to some kind of a trade-off, a trade-off where the U.S. would provide them the political space and political security in exchange for real, verifiable counterterrorism cooperation. That's exactly what's happening in Syria right now. But here's the trick, because it also involves the non-Taliban side. I think any U.S. engagement policy has to be built around that kind of clear value proposition. Who is more pragmatic among the Taliban? Who is more pragmatic among the non-Taliban? Who's willing to deal? And that means, the U.S. would have to renegotiate that value proposition in terms of its engagement both with the Taliban and non-Taliban side, because it's no longer about ideals, at least not in Trump's world. It's about leverage and outcomes. And I think that would be kind of the pragmatic way forward, even if it's quite distasteful, quite uncomfortable. But then again, if you ask me, my pragmatism may be another person's bad idea. But at some point, I think we have to kind of stop chasing those unicorns. And that's why it's very important to engage with both the Taliban and non-Taliban sides, who actually have that convening power, but also convincing power, and those with real influence and kind of clear organizing idea that's backed with a functioning leadership. But if you take fixed position and rigid position, I don't think it's going to get you on the table.
Yeah.
Yeah, Lisa, I'd like to move on to questions, so please go ahead, but briefly.
Okay. I wouldn't call it a fixed position. I would call it a principled position, and I would call it a people-centered position. I would call it looking at the Afghan people and what they want, and the kinds of frustrations that we see expressed among the Afghan population. I'm not sure what you mean when you say the society collapsed, because I think that, the 20-year mission in the Afghanistan did bring about changes. There was education of women, there was empowerment of women, there was development of the economy, there was, a constitution developed, there were elections. These are not things that go away overnight. And so I think that, I think we'll just have to agree to disagree on this idea that in order for the U.S., the only policy option available is to just, engage with the Taliban and just forget about any of the other objectives that the U.S. might have had for the region. I think, the only difference is we don't have troops on the ground. Yes, that, that's a loss of leverage, but we still have objectives that are similar to what we had for those 20 years that we were in Afghanistan. Those fundamental objectives have not changed, and we just have to find different ways to achieve them. And so I just take issue with this idea that the U.S. has no other policy option but to, become friends with the Taliban, hold its nose, accept what they're doing to women, accept that they don't allow women to be educated, accept that they can flog people in public. I just really take fundamental issue with that, and would certainly argue for a much more nuanced policy that doesn't give up our counterterrorism interests, but marries those up with our interests in human rights and women's rights, and pursuing both at the same time.
Well, as I say, I'd like to move on to the questions, but if we have time to come back to this, because I think it does have to be asked, Lisa, whether there are any reasons to believe that the Taliban would change its position on some of the particular human rights, women's education, and under what circumstances might they change? Because I think we're all agreed here that we've had a long time here to try to get them to see why a more reasonable policy on those is in their interest and so on. We haven't succeeded. And to ask why, what, if anything, aside from what we're doing now, might improve the situation. And we ought to also add in what might happen internally within the Taliban that perhaps we could influence that would do that. But let me just get at a couple of questions here that are among the many that we had. There are just two or three that stand out. Carl Indefith has asked, what about the Afghan refugees and those we left behind? What is the Trump administration doing here? I fear we're not doing enough. Well,
I mean, I think I would have to agree with Ambassador Indifferent on this point. I mean, you think about the various pathways that the United States created for Afghans. There's the refugee admissions program. It was perhaps the most important, and that's been frozen with at least 100,000. Probably without paths to the United States, and then others who were about to come here. The temporary protected status was just suspended or not renewed. That's 10,000. You can read the Trump administration justification for this, which came out yesterday or the day before, and I think you see, you perhaps could concede that the economy in Afghanistan is slightly better than it was a year ago. It's only dire rather than exceptionally dire, but on every other metric that they put forward, the situation appears to me to be the same or worse than it was before. So I think this is, sadly, I read this as a pretextual effort to close this pathway to people who will be at risk if they return to Afghanistan. And some of these, particularly in the refugee pipeline, are in third countries now. And then I think we've seen that the asylum pathway takes a highly litigious and individualized approach to work its way through the U.S., to work a case through the U.S. system. And that's also being slowed in very significant ways by this administration. Many of these people would be granted asylum in ordinary times, and these are not ordinary times. So I think, if you look, the SIV pathway is still there to some extent, but if you look structurally at what this administration has done, it has closed off most of these pathways in ways that I think are very, very hard to justify on economic or security grounds. And I think I don't see any immediate change to that on the part of the administration's posture. But I think it sends a really terrible and if not heartbreaking message to America's partners, both in Afghanistan and in other parts of the world, who have stood with us during difficult conflicts that mattered to the United States.
Yes, quickly, Lisa.
Yeah, I would go even further, and I would say this ending TPS status for 10,000 Afghans living here in the United States will be a stain on the Trump administration. Look, Trump criticized Biden for a chaotic withdrawal, but I think he's making a mistake when it comes to forcing our allies, people who worked with us for 20 years and now are being deported back to a Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. And it's pretty much a joke when the DHS says that the security situation has improved enough for people to go back. We know that they will be in danger. We have read about the treatment of former ANDSF, former Afghan government officials, the abuse and torture of women activists and others. So I think it's going to be a stain on the Trump administration and its Afghanistan policy.
Okay, David Sadi has asked this question. India has been playing the Afghan card against Pakistan, handing over the Delhi embassy to the Taliban, sending high-ranking charge to Kabul, and reportedly supplying TTP and Baluch forces with assistance. How successful will this Indian strategy be? Takes us in a slightly different direction, but
Okay, I could offer a few thoughts. I don't think it's anything different than what the Indians have been doing since 1947, really, in terms of whoever was in power in Afghanistan. This idea of proxies isn't exclusive to just the Pakistanis. The Indians have used it as well. It would appear to be, certainly in Balochistan and elsewhere. It's always been a concern of Pakistan, very much a driving consideration for them in their support to the Taliban during all those years, was mitigating against the potential of the influence. And I think, engagement with India is okay for the Taliban government. I think they believe it's okay and they use it themselves. So I think there is certainly India sees advantage in it. I think the Taliban sees advantage in it because they both use it as leverage against Pakistan, but it's nothing that's going to threaten Pakistan's survival, just kind of irritate and be another arrow in the quiver based on what we've seen again since 1947.
okay, Javid.
Two very quick points. One to Lisa's earlier comment. My point was that U.S. policy shouldn't be, to wait out the Taliban uncertainty, just like it has been so far, mainly because ordinary Afghans, including women, or especially women, don't have the luxury of waiting anymore, or say for another 3 years or 4 years. So why they shouldn't wait? Because, at this point, there's no uniform resistance on a large scale among the non-Taliban side that would basically, warrant that that the United States kind of treats women issue as a key national security priority, which I think is not going to happen. Second point was about the refugees. From how I see it, there's a different angle to this one. There are two different kind of groups here. One is the at-risk Afghan population who needs resettlement, and then there's also a much smaller risky group or risky population, some of whom are already in the U.S. that may require kind of organized removal for security reasons. We saw it in Oklahoma, where there's a young Afghan man who plotted an election day attack last year in coordination with ISIS, and that kind of it was a reminder that in the diaspora, there's some serious issues. So if you look at it from a U.S. government standpoint, if they're determining right now that the Taliban control Afghanistan is no longer considered a threat to these returning refugees, and they're ending the, that TPS status for, thousands of Afghans, then I would say it suggests something very important. That is that maybe the US sees that its relationship with the Taliban is at least partially de-risked. One, because the Taliban have kind of shown that consistent staying power on the military, political, religious side, kind of which made their rule more predictable. And the second is that because the Taliban kind of remains an unpredictable group in many ways, engagement, whether that engagement happens directly or indirectly, is kind of the only way forward to build a minimum level of predictability and maybe avoid future surprises.
Lisa, we're just about out of time, so go ahead.
Oh, I was just
Hard
going
to
to
say
say,
this, but yeah, but even if repatriation happens right now of these Afghans, I think the real question would be, will this happen without some kind of engagement with the Taliban? And if so, would the Taliban accept them without reprisal or without something in return?
I just wanted to point out what a major change this is in India's policy toward the Taliban. In the late 90s, when the Taliban was in power, India, Russia, Iran all worked together to support the Northern Alliance fighting the Taliban. So this is a significant change that now we see the Indian Foreign Secretary has met with the Taliban foreign minister. You know, they have a mission in Afghanistan. They're dealing directly with the Taliban. This is a major change for India, and I think, you know, they're trying to do it to undermine Pakistan's relationship with the Taliban. I think they just decided for whatever reason that it would be a tactically better strategy for them to try to court the Taliban and get on their good side so that they could try to drive a wedge between the Taliban and Pakistan. We don't know how it will work out for them. We'll see.
Well, we are out of time, and I don't know if I can express fully enough how appreciative I am, and I'm sure our viewing audience, for what has been really a super discussion. We've covered a lot of ground. No, we didn't get to half of our questions, but we covered them, I think, tangentially as we were going. So thank you, panelists, so very much. I ought to impanel you on a more or less permanent basis because you're just there with so loquaciously with so many good comments and wishing everyone the best. Good afternoon.